POWs, MIAs. Servicemen who were unaccounted for after the Vietnam War continued to trouble the nation. In July, families of some missing military personnel heckled President Bush so badly that he told them to, quote, sit down and shut up. Just one day before that incident, President Bush had signed an executive order releasing 1.3 million pages of documentation, nearly 20 years worth, relating to the fate of the 2,266 missing Vietnam servicemen. Some critics say these documents may contain evidence that Americans were left behind when we quit Vietnam in 1973, and that 5 successive administrations failed to act on that evidence. Question: did we really leave soldiers behind when we withdrew from Vietnam, or did people and institutions create a POW-MIA myth because of hidden agendas, exploiting a nation's grief for their own ends? We'll ask our guests, John Sommer, Executive Director of the Washington office of the American Legion, and H. Bruce Franklin, Professor of English and American Studies at Rutgers University and author of MIA, Mythmaking in America. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our distinguished panel.
Direct from Studio 2 at CNBC, McLaughlin, a spontaneous, unrehearsed discussion on today's most interesting issues and personalities. And now your host, John McLaughlin.
John Sommer of the American Legion and Bruce Franklin of Rutgers. Let me go right to the central question. Is it your felt belief or intuition or knowledge that there are any living American servicemen in Vietnam?
The preponderance of evidence that is available leads me to believe that, yes, there are prisoners living in Vietnam. It's difficult to say how many. I'm not talking about thousands, but it's been shown that there were some left once Operation Homecoming took place.
That was 1973, when we exited Vietnam.
That's correct. And I have no reason to believe that there are not some living there now.
Is there evidence that there were, it is alleged 133, that's what Senator John Kerry of Massachusetts says. But is there evidence that there were 133 who were left there? Or is that surmise?
Senator Kerry's statement, I'm sure, was based on evidence because he's very careful in what he says about this issue. Prior to that, the day before, Senator Bob Smith, the vice chairman of the committee,
Republican from
New Hampshire.
A senator?
Yes, sir, made the statement that he had seen evidence that was in the possession of the committee that led him to believe that there were prisoners in Vietnam and Laos as late as 1989.
Do you care to speak to this, Bruce?
Certainly, John. My research shows exactly how this belief was concocted, who did it, what their motives were, what their agenda was. In fact, there has yet to be a single shred of verifiable evidence or even credible evidence that any American POWs were retained after Operation Homecoming. And I think to understand this issue, you really have to look at the history of how this belief was created, how it was foisted off on the American people, what the motives were, and what the effects are.
We'll get into that as the program proceeds. So you are denying flat out that there are any living American servicemen in Vietnam or Laos, correct?
Well, let's put it this way. You cannot disprove a negative. So there's no logical way to disprove something like that. What we can say is that there is absolutely no
what about Kerry's
credible evidence.
Whatever Kerry has. What about Kerry's documentation?
Kerry's statement about 133 really refers to discrepancy cases. And he tried to indicate in his opening statement, that was on June 24th, that people should not interpret that as meaning that these were definitely living POWs. What they were doing was pulling together all the lists that had been provided to them by the Pentagon. Now, in fact, that number is wildly higher than any previous number. The maximum number of discrepancy cases at the time was 56.
What is Kerry's motive in fabricating if that's what he's doing?
No, Kerry, I don't think Kerry's fabricating. I think that Kerry honestly wants to see this issue resolved. I believe that.
Is he really pointing a finger at the Pentagon and saying this has not been satisfactorily answered? Is that what he's doing?
He's doing that, but it's a mistake to think that the committee is John Kerry, because in fact, that committee is very much dominated by three men who've been crucial in putting out this myth. That is Senators Helms, Grassley, and Smith. Their staff has had tremendous influence on the committee. And I think that if you look at the history of their involvement, you see how they too were part of the whole process of falsification of evidence.
You sense a sinister motivation in the senators that you just mentioned, namely Helms and Grassley and Smith.
The document that they
all of whom happen to be Republicans.
The document that they put out in May 1991, which was intended to help create this committee, is a completely phony document full of lies and misinformation, and that's been well documented.
Now, you see, you're causing a great deal of grief for this gentleman. I can see right here that he's dying to speak. What do you want to say, John?
Well, let me start with the discrepancy cases. First off, the figures that Senator Kerry had were not entirely based on the discrepancy cases that are being investigated in Vietnam now. The discrepancy cases were a list of individuals put together by General Vesey and his staff of individuals who were last known alive or last known in the hands of the captors. That's not the same information that Senator Kerry used in his deduction that there were at least 133
What's the point
people.
you're getting at?
Well, I'm correcting what Mr. Franklin said.
The mistake of his scholarship. Correct.
There are other data available on which they have based these conclusions.
Well, let me ask you this: do you think that the heckling that has been administered to George Bush by the National League of Families of POWs in Vietnam, that heckling is unjustified?
It's not unjustified when you look at the frustration level of these individuals who are family members of those military people who have been missing for 20 years or longer, and the fact that the government has not come up with answers to where they might be, whether or not some of them are still alive.
You're saying that the Pentagon has done a lousy job over the years. Is that what you're saying?
That's correct. And
you go along with that contention.
Yes, but from the opposite side. I think there's one area that John and I probably agree on, I would guess, and that is that we would both feel that all the documents that the Pentagon has on this should be declassified.
Well, the president has just declassified over 1 million documents. You want more than that?
Under pressure from the committee. I mean, it was the committee and the Senate voted unanimously to declassify those documents. But the real questions: why is the Pentagon keeping all these documents? The Cold War's over.
Do you credit the president for declassifying the documents, John?
The executive order that the president signed was a step in the right direction.
Was it a compulsory act on his part? Was it an involuntary act? Forced upon him?
It was brought about by the request of the Senate Select Committee and organizations.
But he didn't have to go along, did he?
He didn't have to, no.
So he gets some credit, but it's limited credit.
It's a step
and the
in the
committee
right
gets
direction.
the most credit. We'll be right back. Is that true?
overjoyed to be back among friends, we realize that some 300 fellow Americans are still held prisoner in North Vietnam.
Some feel that George Bush is getting a bum rap by these hecklers. And one of those people is a man by the name of John McCain. John McCain served for 5.5 years, 5.5 years in the Hanoi Hilton, at least part of the time. The prisoner of war, held by the Vietnamese. And he wrote to the president after the heckling in late July, "For those of us who know your efforts, the depth of your commitment is unmistakably clear. More than any other president since the end of the Vietnam War, you have sought to make the accounting of our POW MIAs one of the nation's highest priorities. You have ordered an extraordinary increase of the resources and personnel devoted to resolving this issue. You have reorganized and greatly expanded our field operations and the Joint Task Force to search for our mission in Southeast Asia." He speaks about appointing a permanent representative in Hanoi to look into this. And then there's that whole General Vesey matter, which he's accountable for. So do you think it is a bum rap, before we leave the matter of the culpability, the alleged culpability of the president in not making materials available by the National League of Families? I ask you.
Well, first of all, the National League of Families' position as an organization was to oppose declassification, not to favor it. This is very different from the National Alliance of Families.
Excuse me, I meant to say the
Right.
National Alliance.
Right. Now, to understand Bush's role, we have to understand the government's role. And the government's role for 5 administrations has been to keep this issue ambiguous. Their position is maybe they're live POWs, maybe they're not live POWs.
Yes, but it is a tough call. It is a tough call.
No.
If they over-suggest that the people are alive over there, servicemen are alive, you can compound the grief of the families by pulling the rug from underneath them.
And every administration has known the truth of the matter. Whether it's the truth that John thinks or it's the truth that I think, the administration is in a position to know. And George Bush was in a position to know when he was head of the Central Intelligence Agency in 1976.
You don't think you're being too much of a conspiratorialist, do you, Bruce?
I'm not talking about conspiracy. I'm talking about something which I've documented.
What possible
thoroughly in the book.
motive could Jimmy Carter have had in concealing all of this?
The same motive that every other administration has had, to use the issue as a pretext to keep hostilities going against Vietnam, to keep from normalizing relations with Vietnam, in effect, to keep the war going.
There are 2 reasons why the administration has refused to develop or normalize diplomatic relations with Vietnam. Namely, they haven't given us all the information at their disposal with regard to POWs, MIAs, and B, because they had their troops fighting in Cambodia.
No. This began in February '73. Henry Kissinger went to Hanoi. This was before the completion of Operation Homecoming. He had 2 documents in hand. One document was Nixon's secret promise to give $3.25 billion of aid to North Vietnam, as agreed on in the Paris Peace Accord. The other document was a list of 80 alleged discrepancy cases. Kissinger testified in September '73 that we were not going to honor our pledge because Vietnam had not given us sufficient accounting. And that's how this issue has been used since February '73, right on through July 1992.
You want to comment on this observation?
Well, yes. First off, the Congress decided that the money that was going to be given or had been offered by the Nixon administration was not going to be given after they heard the stories of the torture and the torment that the prisoners of war who were released underwent. The big problem is, I think you can't fault the total administration of any administration with respect to the POW MIA issue. The problem is that it is so far down in the bowels of the bureaucracy that information doesn't lift to the top. I think the president's been ill-served by some of his advisors. There are people within agencies of government who have been charged with handling the POW MIA issue who have not done their job, and that's been shown by internal reports that are being declassified now that show the ineptness with respect to the way that the cases have been handled.
John Summers and Bruce Franklin will be right back to resume our conversation with regard to the POWs and MIAs right after this.